Yeah, and it always seems like this moment is particularly hectic or this moment is filled with crisis, and then there's another moment of crisis. And and that was one of the things I wanted to talk with you about because I know that you have a background as an activist who then moved into plant medicine and,
Hmm.
other things, I'm sure, in the service of transformation. So, just on let's start with just on a little bit. How do you, when we're in the midst of so much suffering or injustice, how how do you how do you look at the world right now? How do you keep yourself grounded? How do you keep yourself in a positive frame of mind?
Well, first, acknowledging what you just said, every generation of humans thinks that their particular time is particularly tragic, right? And there's a lot of suffering and pain. And interestingly enough, statistically, there's a lot less pain and suffering, we'll just call it that, in the world right now than there has been. However, because of our ubiquitous reach of media and social media, we just see a lot more of it than a lot of our ancestors did. So I want to acknowledge that. However, it's still a crazy time, and there's still a lot of uncertainty and pain and suffering taking place in the world. Um, for me personally, I kind of tend to kind of cognize humanity as looking at it as one being. If you look at humanity as like a child in its maturation process, we're just kind of in the terrible teens, right? So I tend to think as bad as things look, and they are in a lot of ways, at the same time, we can also just cognize this as a maturation process of growing up. And, we're getting some hard lessons and we're learning what we need to learn, hopefully, and move forward from here.
Mm. Well, let's talk about you and your personal journey. So I just want to say out loud that I have been fangirling you. Oh my God. I love your music. I love your music. I
Thank
love
you.
your podcast interviews. One of the songs, Grateful, when I heard that
Yeah.
song, oh my gosh. And then your Bird Tribes album. I have bought everything that I've listened to. In addition to listening to it for free, I want to say that out loud because I think it's so important to actually make sure we give money to musicians, and not just use
Yeah, for
them on
sure.
free platforms.
Thank you for that. Yeah. The music has definitely become part of my activism in a way. And giving a little bit of context to what you were sharing earlier. So I was in a community of people that were activists. We were, this started with the Iraq War, that kind of woke up to the importance of doing that. And I was in a community of people that was the culture. We go to protests, we go to rallies. And at this one particular protest, we were going down the streets of LA and there were lots of police officers lying in the street. And the idea was that we were told that they were there, to protect us and protect the marchers. But it kind of became clear that what they were actually doing was kind of confining the march. So that basically they were ensuring that we were only preaching to the choir, is what I realized. And I knew that because when we got to this one overpass overlooking the freeway in LA, all the protesters ran over and held up their signs, people were honking the horns, and all of a sudden the police got really engaged, right? It was like, oh, now you're speaking to people who are not in this march. And I just had this kind of a moment of epiphany, in the midst of all that, which happens often to people. I had this awareness that although protests are important for raising consciousness and awareness around things, um, really the front lines of any type of activism is consciousness. Just about raising awareness, expanding consciousness. I had already started doing that work for myself personally. And I just realized that that was where I was going to be most effective. And I just kind of switched gears. And so I was doing plant medicine at the time and a few other things in terms of exploration, in addition to just studying, world religions and mysticism and philosophy and all those things. And I thought, okay, what we really need is a revolution in consciousness. That's where I'm going to focus my work. And an extension of that became the music, for sure, because the music that I write and produce comes out of that awareness. It comes out of the plant medicine work that I do. So getting that out into the world became an extension of that. And, I kind of thought, am I just delusional? Can this even be, effective? And then almost right away, you brought up Grateful, particularly. I still get messages from people all over the world, literally, saying something like, you don't know me, but I was online, you know, uh, scrolling and Googling around, and I landed on your song Grateful. And now I listen to it every morning, and it is the thing that has like either pulled me out of my depression or has helped me kind of ground myself before I enter the day. And that was the confirmation I needed that getting the music out to people was important and could actually carry the medicine, as we like to say, for sure.
Mm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So the Iraq War, this was in the 90s. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, so that's interesting because I was in LA around the same time.
Ah,
So,
yeah.
so that's an interesting connection that we have.
Hmm.
And and yeah, so what does it really take to make change? And so for you, you're saying it's revolutionizing consciousness, it's expanding consciousness. And music is one pathway to do that. And then you've alluded to plant medicine. So um, tell us a little bit more about the plant medicine path as a way to expand consciousness, um, as a way to evolve us, help us mature as a whole as a humanity.
Yeah, there is taking place right now in the world, particularly in the West, that is called the psychedelic renaissance. You know, um, and there that term is questionable for a lot of reasons that we won't get into. However, the spirit of it is real in the sense that what was started in the '60s, um, as I would think kids playing with fire, right? But this introduction to the possibility of plant medicines and psychedelics for expanding consciousness was planted as a seed. It was put on the radar, and of course, we all know how that went. But now, with maturity, I think, and with more research and understanding about the power of them, it's revolutionizing everything from mental health work, you know, to spiritual pursuit and kind of expansions, yeah, of consciousness, which is what we're talking about. Um, for me, about 29 years ago, I went to my first ayahuasca ceremony, and I didn't know what it was at the time. A lot of people didn't. The internet was around, but I wasn't on it. And most of my friends weren't on it. It was kind of this new thing that a bunch of people were doing, right? Um, so this friend came into a coffee house I was working at, and he said, "Hey, there's going to be an ayahuasca ceremony this weekend. Would you like to go?" And like everybody back then, we said, "I what?" But I went because it sounded really intriguing, and hated every minute of that experience. However, the week following, I realized that something had shifted. It's a hard thing to put into words, but um, I knew that something had shifted in my consciousness. I was seeing and feeling and interacting with the world differently, and I was very intrigued. So I went back the next time I was invited, and the rest is history. I eventually ended up studying with lots of indigenous people, started exploring and studying psychedelics in their intentional use, not just for tripping, um, for psychotherapeutic work, and eventually became, in places where it was legal to do so, a facilitator for plant medicine ceremonies and guiding people through psychedelic work. And, you know, to kind of answer your question, the interesting thing about working with plant medicines, and we're talking about in a ceremonial context, right, an intentional group setting,
Right.
is that the part of the healing experience, of course, is personal, right? You're having your personal journey, you're having personal healing, you know, but it's also transpersonal because you are not only tapping into ancestral healing, right? And which lives in our DNA, our ancestral experiences. But who you become as a person because of that and clearing up this ancestral, junk, we'll call it, and baggage, also starts to translate into the world, right? How you are with your friends, how you are with your family. One of the most common experiences people have, particularly with ayahuasca, because that's what I'm most familiar with, is this impulse and drive immediately to want to clean up past relationships and improve your family and, you know, friend relationships. So in that, yeah, it moves from personal to transpersonal. And the most important thing, getting at the heart of your question is, I have found without a doubt that I think the main reason, the kind of the core reason for most of the pain and suffering we see in the world, certainly in terms of man's inhumanity to itself, that phrase, is this lack of connection. It's this loss of connection with each other. It's this loss of connection with nature, a loss of connection with the cosmos. That is the most common thing that an ayahuasca and plant medicine ceremony brings back into your life. You suddenly get reinvigorated with this sense of connection to everything. And when you have that sense of connection, how you move in the world, how you treat other people, the other, as we like to call it, shifts, right? You start realizing there is no other. You can no longer watch the news and see what's happening, let's say in the Middle East right now, as we're recording this, and see it as something happening over there. You actually take it personally, right? You see it as something happening to species. So I say the beautiful thing about the plant medicine work is that you move from an individual consciousness into what I call species consciousness. You suddenly realize that this is about all of us. This is about humanity as a whole.
Yeah, yeah. I've been, one of the when I had was working with different plant medicines, one of the things that I just realized was, what, perception is everything. In the sense of,
Absolutely.
I was like, on the simplest level, if I say the room is empty, but then my son popped up because he had been laying down on the couch, oh, it wasn't empty, but it's what I could perceive. And I just started thinking about that in terms of racial justice and social justice work. What if we're working with a level of perception that was too small? What?
Yeah, you're speaking to exactly that was the deeper understanding and kind of the ramifications of the experience I had that I spoke about earlier. I realized for me that I was playing and responding to the world from a place that was too small. My perception of what was actually going on was too small.
Right. It's like
Yeah,
this lens was, you needed to elevate, or at least for me, that's what it was. It was like elevate to see more of the picture, you know?
yeah, for sure. Yeah, yeah, and that includes having a deeper understanding of what we will call geopolitics. And what I mean by that is, as opposed to just being reactionary, I can't believe our government just did so and so. I must go out and protest. When you can connect the dots and have a larger understanding of the history of humanity, the history of relations between countries and peoples, right? When things happen, you have a larger understanding and context for what's happening, right? So you're less reactionary and much more strategic and I think holistic in your response to what is happening, right? A lot of things that people get really upset about aren't the things that deserve our attention. Those are the things that we are being manipulated to, care about and respond to. But if you have a larger understanding about what's happening, it's like, oh, I understand what's happening there, but this is still actually about this, right? This is the thing that's actually at the core of this particular confrontation, right? I mean, for instance, right now on the planet, as we all know, at least people that are paying attention to it, there's a whole reorganization of the power structures of countries, which the United States, of course, is knee deep in. And a lot of what we're watching on the news are actually symptoms of these larger chess pieces being played. So when you're out in the street and complaining, are having really deep emotional reactions to things, you don't realize that you're actually giving a manipulated response, right, to what's taking place. Right? But when
Yes.
you look at it holistically, you're like, oh, this is what's actually taking place. And if I understand that, then this is where I can actually make a difference in terms of my energy and wanting to participate.
Which is why you went to in the direction of expanding consciousness or shifting
For
consciousness.
me, yes.
Hmm.
Yeah. And and I don't want to come across as making light of the deep emotional responses that people are having to things like what's happening with, in the Middle East right now. Those very human knee-jerk responses are also really valuable because they put what's happening in the world on the radar of people. It brings it down to a very human, like, this thing happened, it's horrific, and I'm shouting about it, right? Um, and then people also have emotional responses to that. The challenge is, as I mentioned earlier, is you want to be clear that what you're responding to is actually real, right? And that it is what it is being portrayed to be. Oftentimes, when you raise the veil and look underneath, you realize, like, oh, this is all part of a larger strategy, and I'm being manipulated, right? And the reason nobody cares, in terms of like countries and leaders about my emotional response to this is they were expecting that was calculated, right?
Yes. Have you ever thought about organizations that we might? I'm tiptoeing here, but I'm a tiptoe in though, because sometimes
Yeah.
I think that organizations that I have historically supported regarding justice, I started to think, these organizations are triggering my fear. It's almost like they're hitting the same uh, button, or they're pressing the same button to get a reaction from me so that I will, donate to the cause, or so I will turn up out
Of
in the
course.
street. And but then, but then I started thinking, wait, but my nervous system is my responsibility. You know what I mean? So all of this stuff coming at me isn't necessarily in my best interest. You know what I mean? All of a
Or,
sudden I started
well,
pulling it apart.
it's not even in the interest of the people that you think you're helping through
Well,
some of these organizations.
well, then you start thinking, well, you know, again, I don't want to call any names here, but like they have a vested interest in things appearing to be really bad so that you will, again, give them your attention and your money, like what they
Well,
focus
look,
on.
yeah, our time is limited, so we can not tiptoe. We don't need to call names, but we can speak directly what you're speaking of. When you're scrolling something like Instagram, and every third or fourth image is an organization that they start with a horrific image of what's happening in Gaza, for instance, and then right underneath, if you look carefully, it's a manipulation. It's like this horrible thing is happening in Gaza. The people need our support. The manipulation is that give money to us and we can help solve this problem. But we actually know, if you've seen images of what's happening in Gaza, there are miles and miles of trucks of aid that are sitting there parked waiting to get into Gaza and deliver this aid. They're not being allowed in, right? So I think most people are sophisticated enough to know that most organizations, not all, have an ongoing fund or its body of money that they continually build, right? And it's mostly to pay for their administrative work. It's to be self-sustaining. And no matter what the newest crisis is, they will advertise that to get you to give money to that organization. They may or may not be directly involved in the conflict that you think you're donating to at all, right? More power to them. So we don't need to call out names. If what you want to do is support, let's say, people in Israel or children in Gaza, you have to actually do your homework and see, which is very easy to do by going to their websites. Is my giving $30 to this organization directly supporting what I think it's supporting in this particular conflict? Whereas Haiti or Africa or someplace, the Ukraine war, whatever it is, you want to be sure that you're actually in support of the thing that you think you are. And this is probably an overestimation, but I'm willing to bet that 9 times out of 10 you aren't.
Yeah,
Right? You're
yeah,
just giving money away so that you feel good and that you can relieve yourself of maybe the guilt or the helplessness around the whole thing. And that's what they're banking on.
right,
Yeah.
right, right. So, but let's look at music or plant medicine as another form of action. So when you see something like this happening, you know, in the Middle East or in, in Western Sahara or in Los Angeles, you know, what can you do? What can we do with our consciousness that would um, shift things or that would make more of a difference? Is there something energetically? I'm asking myself this question too, so I just really want to hear your answer to it. Is there something we can do energetically that shifts the bigger context?
Yeah, it's a multi-dimensional kind of question, you know. So I'll tackle it. Well, first, I would say individually, first of all, we're all carrying around the anxiety and stress from the particular conflicts, that you tune into. And as you know, that affects our immune system and our health and our ability to respond to anything, right? To respond to life. Um, so first of all, having whether it's plant medicine or just some group cathartic kind of ceremonial experience, gives you personally a place to process what is happening, right? So that you can be holistic, right, in your feeling of the world without letting it take you down and incapacitating you. Um,
Mhm.
if there is a group consciousness, and we believe there is, um, every person that kind of unplugs from the reactionary, we'll call it, mainstream kind of collective view of the world
Mhm.
and moves into a more expansive state of consciousness is contributing to the collective consciousness. In a more practical way, there's a group a lot of people have heard of called the Institute of Heart Math, right? They've done, with some other groups, some amazing research that, in a nutshell, this is very layman's terms, and their science is questionable by some people. However, I like it a lot and it makes sense to me. So I'm sharing one of the things that they've done is like have a group meditation of 1,000 people in a particular city and all focus meditating at the same time, same place. And it turns out in the studies that they've done that the crime rates in that city dropped significantly for the time that they were meditating. They also basically say that the human emotions that we feel get encoded and kind of broadcast into our electromagnetic field, which a lot of people refer to as the aura. And those fields are the things that are always in communication with each other. Like when we walk into a room, we're already communicating with each other before we open our mouth. And the theory is that that electromagnetic field is also in communication with the planetary electromagnetic field. Um, so that is kind of the basis of this idea that if you only need a certain percentage of the human population to move into a place of coherence, we'll call it, feelings of love and joy and gratitude and so forth, and peace, right? For that to kind of tip over and have an effect on the entire, right, species. So if I look at it from that point of view, every weekend that dozens, if not hundreds, of intentional psychotherapeutic kind of ceremonies are taking place, that's like thousands of people that are moving into this coherent state of being that are helping to kind of, as I like to say, calm the war. Yeah.
Yeah. And your music, getting back to your music and your new album, that's part of that. That's
It is definitely part of that. And I wouldn't have thought so. I would have thought it was kind of like, I'm very interesting in that I like to call it maybe a very sober mystic, meaning I'm a spiritual person, very interested in mysticism, but I'm also very grounded and suspicious, right? Healthily so, of anything that is like, spiritual woo woo. Because if it's real, then it's kind of quantifiable. Meaning, if it's real, then you should be able to kind of reverse engineer that thing and figure out why it works and improve its efficacy, sort of. So I approach spiritual work in that way, kind of almost scientifically, right? Or at least realistically, I'd like to say. So I originally thought, am I just being kind of like an idealist thinking that the music can make a difference? And then right away I realized that's absurd because you can just look at the music that was coming from, let's say, well, a lot of the artists, but in my case particularly, let's just pick one, Marvin Gaye, What's Going On. That music became the soundtrack for consciousness to a degree during that period. And a lot of other artists, were doing similar music. Um, it absolutely spoke to what was happening and unified people, right? And it kind of set a particular tone. And if you mentioned, perception earlier, it gave you a way to conceptualize and perceive and place yourself in what was happening during those times. So fast forwarding to myself, as I mentioned, I get messages from people all the time telling me, similar to what I talked about with Grateful. It's like, oh, I stumbled upon your song, Come to Me Yet, and or your music in general. And that has now been kind of the soundtrack for me. It's getting me through this particularly challenging time period, whether it's personal challenge or like global challenge. So in ways that I don't fully understand, but I'm always like, you know, seeking to understand more, the music definitely works. And my music particularly, since I think that is its focus and its intention, um, in some ways, again, that I don't fully understand, it is translating and it is communicating my intention. It's a phenomenal thing to be a part of and to kind of constantly observe and understand because I want to be better and better at it as I move along.
So we're going to take a break to hear word from our sponsor, and we'll be right back.